Montana Territory, 1882. While neighbors framed cabin roofs with light rafters and shallow pitches, a Norwegian immigrant named Erik Lindqvist was hauling massive timbers up a mountainside, logs so thick 2 men couldn't wrap their arms around them. He raised a roof so steep it looked more like a tent than a house, pitched at nearly 60 degrees. His neighbors called it a waste of good timber. They called it a Norseman's folly. "That roof will slide every shingle come first snow," said George Tanner, who'd been building in mountain country for 15 years. "And those timbers. Overkill. A roof don't need to hold a locomotive." Then December 1882 arrived with the worst blizzard in 40 years. Snow fell for 9 days. Winds gusted past 70 miles an hour. Drifts buried fence posts and collapsed barns across the valley. When the skies cleared, 11 cabin roofs had caved in. But Erik's roof? It stood unchanged, having shed snow as fast as it fell, while the massive timbers held firm against winds that tore lighter roofs apart. What did this immigrant understand about pitch and timber that 15 years of American building had completely missed? My name is Will, and this is Old America. If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. Erik Lindqvist arrived in Montana Territory in the spring of 1882 with a broadaxe, a draw knife, and memories of the mountain villages where he'd grown up in Norway's Hardanger region. His family had been timber framers for 6 generations, not just carpenters, but men who understood wood the way a shipwright understands the sea. Erik had learned early that a roof wasn't just a cover. It was the first defense against everything the sky could deliver. And in mountain country, the sky could deliver 10 feet of wet snow in a single storm. But it was something else he'd learned in Norway that would matter most in Montana: the difference between a roof that fought the snow and one that surrendered to it. His grandfather had shown him village houses where shallow-pitched roofs had collapsed under winter loads, crushing families in their beds. He'd walked through valleys where the only buildings still standing after avalanche winters were the old staved churches and farmhouses with roofs pitched so steep the snow couldn't hold. The old man had a saying: "A gentle roof invites the snow to stay. A steep roof tells it to go." Erik chose his claim specifically for the timber stands on the upper slopes. The trees there were old-growth Douglas fir, some nearly 4 feet in diameter, grown slow and dense in the mountain air. While other settlers prized meadowland and creek access, Erik wanted timber, the raw material for building something that could carry more weight than any storm could deliver. The cabin walls went up first, conventional enough in their construction, squared logs notched at the corners and chinked with moss and clay. His neighbors nodded approval and expected him to frame the roof in the standard American fashion. 2x6 rafters at 24-inch spacing, pitched at 4 and 12, or maybe 5 and 12 for the mountain snow. A man could frame such a roof in 3 days and shingle it in 2 more. Instead, Erik began felling the largest trees on his claim. George Tanner rode up in early July to see what the Norwegian was doing. Tanner had built 19 cabins in the territory and considered himself the authority on mountain construction. He found Erik squaring a log that would have made a respectable ship's mast, working it with a broadaxe into a beam nearly 16 inches square. Chips flew with each stroke, and the smell of fresh-cut fur hung thick in the summer air. "That's a lot of timber for a ridgepole," Tanner said, studying the massive beam taking shape. "Most men use an 8-inch log and call it plenty." Eric showed him the drawing he'd scratched on a piece of birch bark, a roof profile that rose at an angle Tanner had never seen on a frontier cabin. 60 degrees, Eric explained in his accented English. Snow slides off. No weight builds up. Tanner squinted at the drawing, then at the mountainside above them where last winter's snow still lingered in shaded hollows. 60 degrees? That's church steeple steep. You'll waste half your lumber on a roof nobody can walk on, and the wind will catch it like a sail besides. Eric pointed to the massive beam. "Strong enough to hold," he said, "steep enough to shed. This roof will stand when yours is kindling." Tanner left shaking his head, and by evening the story had spread through the valley. The Norwegian was building a roof like a church steeple, wasting timber that could have built 3 normal cabins. The foolishness was remarkable. Here was a man who'd crossed an ocean and didn't understand that American mountain building had already solved the snow problem. You built a solid roof, shoveled when you had to, and accepted that some winters would test your rafters. The framing consumed Eric's entire summer. He felled 12 massive firs and dragged them down the mountain with his 2 oxen, a journey that took half a day for each log. The oxen strained against their yokes on the steeper sections, and more than once Eric had to rig block and tackle to keep a log from running away downhill. He squared them by hand with broadaxe and adze, working each timber to precise dimensions that his neighbors would have considered absurd for residential construction. The ridgepole alone weighed nearly 800 pounds and required a block and tackle system to raise into position. It took Eric and 3 hired hands most of a day to get it seated properly, the men straining at ropes while the massive timber inched skyward. The rafters were equally massive, 8x8 timbers cut from the hearts of old-growth logs, each one strong enough to serve as the main beam in a conventional cabin. Eric spaced them at 16 inches instead of the standard 24, creating a framework so dense with wood that it looked more like the skeleton of a ship than a house. At the peak, he joined each rafter pair with a collar tie, a horizontal beam that prevented the rafters from spreading under load. The joinery was tight enough that you couldn't slip a knife blade between the timbers. The pitch was the detail that drew the most ridicule. 60 degrees from horizontal meant the roof surface climbed nearly 2 feet for every foot of horizontal run. A man standing at the eave could barely reach the first row of shingles without a ladder. And working near the peak required ropes and scaffolding. The surface area was nearly double what a conventional low-pitched roof would have required, meaning twice the shingles, twice the labor, twice the material cost. Margaret Tanner, George's wife, rode over with her husband to observe the peculiar construction. She'd grown up in Minnesota and had seen snow country building before, but nothing like this. "It looks like a Viking longhouse," she said, not unkindly, but with genuine puzzlement, or a hay barn in the old country. Eric nodded, pleased that someone saw the heritage in his design. "In Hardanger," he said, "roofs like this stand for 300 years. Snow slides off before it can pile up. Wind goes over instead of under." He gestured toward the massive ridgepole visible through the open framing. and timber this size don't break, no matter what sits on top. George Tanner studied the framework with a builder's eye, privately impressed by the joinery, even as he doubted the necessity. "I've built in these mountains 15 years, he said. "We get heavy snow, sure, but a normal roof handles it fine if you keep it shoveled. This here is solving a problem that don't exist." Eric's response was quiet but certain. "You haven't seen the storm that breaks normal roofs," he said, "but it will come. The shingles went on in September, split cedar shakes 18 inches long and nearly an inch thick at the butt, twice the thickness of standard roofing shakes. Eric laid them with a 6-inch exposure rather than the typical 10, meaning 3 layers of wood protected every point on the roof surface. The weight of the shingles alone was substantial, but the massive rafters carried it without any sign of deflection. When Eric walked on the completed roof to check his work, the structure felt as solid as the ground itself. The final element was the detail that drew the most mockery. Eric installed heavy iron straps at each point where the rafters met the wall plates, bolting the roof frame to the cabin walls with hardware more commonly seen on bridge construction. His neighbors used wooden pegs or simple toe nailing to attach their rafters, methods that had worked well enough for generations of American building. George Tanner made his prediction public at the October gathering before winter isolation set in. That Norwegian built a roof for a cathedral and put it on a cabin, he announced. Come spring, he'll have the strongest pile of overkill in the territory, and he'll have spent the whole winter wondering why he wasted a summer on timber he didn't need. Snow country building ain't that complicated. You just need enough roof to shed water and enough pitch to slide the heavy stuff. He's got enough roof to cover a dance hall. The others nodded agreement. The Norwegian's massive roof was a curiosity and a half. A monument to old-world excess built by someone who didn't understand that American practicality had already figured out the solution. They gave Eric credit for impressive carpentry and predicted he'd regret the wasted effort when he realized the winter was no worse than any other. The first snow came early on November 8th, dropping 18 inches overnight and testing roofs throughout the valley. Eric woke to find his steep pitch had performed exactly as designed. The snow had slid off in sheets during the night, piling in berms along his cabin walls while his roof showed bare shingles by mid-morning. His neighbors' roofs held their loads, the shallow pitches accumulating snow that would stay until spring or until someone climbed up to shovel. George Tanner didn't bother shoveling after the first storm. 18 inches wasn't enough to stress his rafters, and the insulating effect of the snow actually helped keep his cabin warm. He'd been right about one thing. Normal roofs handled normal snow just fine. The Norwegian's overkill would remain exactly that, more roof than any reasonable winter would ever require. November brought 3 more storms, each one adding to the white blanket that covered the valley. By month's end, most cabin roofs carried 3 feet of accumulated snow, compressed and dense from the weight of each subsequent layer. The settlers didn't worry. 3 feet was manageable, and the real cold hadn't arrived yet to drive anyone up onto an icy roof with a shovel. Eric's roof remained bare. Each storm slid off within hours, the steep pitch refusing to hold anything the sky dropped on it. His only winter challenge was managing the snow berms that built up around his foundation, pushing aside the growing piles that threatened to reach his window sills. He spent more time shoveling around his cabin than his neighbors spent shoveling on top of theirs. But his shovel work was easy ground labor, not dangerous climbing on icy slopes. The other advantages started showing themselves as December arrived with bitter cold. Eric's thick shake roof, with its triple-layered coverage, held heat in ways his neighbor's thinner roofing couldn't match. The massive timber frame, with its dense old-growth wood, kept warmth where it belonged, while his neighbors burned through cordwood trying to heat cabins that leaked warmth through inadequate roofing. Eric's heavy overhead meant his fires worked twice as hard for half the fuel. The Tanner cabin developed a problem in early December that George was reluctant to discuss. The weight of accumulated snow, now approaching 4 feet, had caused his rafters to sag slightly at mid-span, opening gaps between the roof boards where cold air could penetrate. The sag was barely visible from outside, but inside, the ceiling had dropped nearly an inch, and frost formed along the cracks where the boards had separated. On the coldest mornings, George could see his breath even with the fire burning hot. George told himself it was normal settling, that the rafters would spring back come spring when the snow melted. He reinforced the worst spots with props cut from firewood, temporary posts that cluttered his cabin interior but prevented further deflection. Other families were doing the same. The Hendersons had 3 props holding their ceiling, and the Wilsons had abandoned their back room entirely. After the rafters, they began to creak ominously under the load. The whole valley was propping up its roofs and pretending everything was fine. Margaret Tanner visited Eric's cabin in mid-December, bringing a gift of preserves and leaving with observations she shared with her husband that evening. "His ceiling hasn't moved a hair," she reported. "Those big timbers don't even know there's winter outside, and his shingles aren't lifting anywhere. Ours are curling up at the edges where the snow keeps melting and freezing underneath." George dismissed her observations as womanly worry. "The Norwegian overbuilt and got lucky with a mild start to winter," he said. "When the real storms come, we'll see who's standing." He didn't have to wait long. The blizzard began on December 23rd and didn't stop for 9 days. The old-timers would later call it the Christmas Siege, a storm system that stalled over the mountains and dumped snow with a relentless fury that no one in the territory had ever witnessed. The first 3 days dropped 6 feet. The next 3 added 4 more, and the wind never stopped, gusting hard enough to shove a loaded wagon sideways and driving snow horizontally into every gap and crack in every structure in the valley. By the 4th day, the first roof collapsed. The Henderson cabin failed at 3 in the morning, the rafters splintering with a sound like rifle shots that woke families a quarter-mile away. The Hendersons escaped through their front door just as the ceiling came down, running into the blizzard in their nightclothes while their home buried itself in its own debris. They spent the rest of the night in their root cellar, huddled together for warmth, waiting for a dawn that brought nothing but more snow. Their children's teeth chattered so hard they couldn't speak, and the youngest boy's lips turned blue before his mother wrapped him against her chest beneath her coat. The Wilson roof went next. then the Brewster place, then the McKinnon cabin, where 5 children slept in the loft. The McKinnon children survived only because their father had been awake, listening to his rafters groan, and had moved the whole family downstairs minutes before the ceiling gave way. They watched from the front room as the loft floor dropped into the space where their beds had been, bringing half the roof down with it. Snow poured through the gap like water through a broken dam, filling the cabin with white that had to be shoveled out just to keep the doors clear. It went the same way every time. The shallow-pitched roofs had accumulated snow faster than it could consolidate, creating loads that exceeded what light-framed rafters could bear. The weight wasn't distributed evenly. Wind had blown some areas clear, while piling others with massive drifts that turned roof sections into crushing traps. The rafters failed at the points of maximum stress, often near the ridgeline where the 2 slopes met, and once one rafter went, the others followed in a cascade of cracking wood and collapsing structure. You could hear a roof dying from 100 yards off. First the groaning, then the sharp cracks, then the thunder of collapse. The wind made everything worse. Gusts caught the accumulated snow and added sideways force that pushed against roofs designed only to carry weight straight down. Rafters that might have held under pure vertical loading snapped when wind shoved against the snow mass from the side. The iron straps and strong connections that Eric had installed, the hardware his neighbors had mocked as bridge-building overkill, were the only things preventing roofs from simply lifting off their walls and sailing into the storm. By the 7th day, 11 roofs had failed completely or partially. Families crowded into the surviving structures, sharing heat and food and space, while the storm continued to rage outside. The Tanner cabin held, but barely. George had given up sleeping in favor of watching his ceiling, listening for the sounds that would signal collapse, ready to evacuate his family at the first crack. His temporary props had multiplied until the interior looked like a forest of vertical logs, each one holding up a section of roof that should have been able to hold itself. Margaret kept the children dressed in their coats day and night, boots by the door, ready to run. Eric's roof showed no distress at all. The 60-degree pitch shed snow as fast as it fell, maintaining bare shingles while everything around it disappeared under white. The wind that threatened to tear lighter roofs apart flowed over Eric's steep slopes without finding purchase, the angle too sharp to give the gusts anything to grab. The massive timbers didn't creak, didn't sag, didn't give any indication that they noticed the storm at all. Inside, Eric's family slept through nights that kept other families awake with terror, trusting a roof that had been built for exactly this kind of test. On the 8th day, the Tanners came to Eric's door. George had waited as long as pride allowed, but the sounds from his ceiling had changed overnight from occasional groans to continuous creaking, and he'd found a crack in his ridgepole that hadn't been there the day before. The crack ran 6 inches along the grain, and when George pressed his hand against the wood, he could feel it flexing with each gust of wind. His wife carried their infant son wrapped in every blanket they owned. His 2 daughters walked behind, holding hands, old enough to understand that their house was dying around them. Eric let them in without comment. Over the next 2 days, 3 more families arrived. The Hendersons, who'd been sheltering in their root cellar since their roof failed on day 4, half frozen and surviving on cold biscuits and jerked beef. The McKinnons, with their 5 children, evacuated from a cabin that was still standing, but creaking so badly that sleep had become impossible. The Brewsters, whose partial collapse had left them with half a house and no way to heat it, their stove buried under debris they couldn't clear. 17 people crowded into Eric's cabin, but the space felt solid around them. The massive roof overhead hadn't moved a fraction of an inch, despite carrying the highest wind loads of any structure in the valley. The thick shake shingles showed no lifting, no gaps, no sign of the fury raging outside. Children played on floors warmed by a fire that didn't have to fight against heat, escaping through a failing ceiling. For the first time in days, families slept without one ear listening for the sound of cracking wood. George Tanner spent hours staring up at Eric's roof framing, visible where the ceiling boards had been left off near the walls. He studied the joinery, the timber dimensions, the iron straps that tied everything together. "How much does that ridgepole weigh?" he asked. 800 pounds, Eric said, maybe more. And the rafters? 300 each, 24 of them. George did the arithmetic in his head. That's more than 4 tons of timber in the roof frame alone, not counting sheathing or shingles. My whole cabin don't weigh that much. Eric nodded. In Norway, we say a roof should weigh more than what might land on it. Then you know it will hold. Once you saw it, it wasn't complicated. A light roof could be overwhelmed by heavy snow. A heavy roof could not. The steep pitch prevented accumulation, but even if snow somehow built up, the massive structure beneath could carry loads that would reduce lighter framing to splinters. Eric had built for the worst case and then added margin beyond that. His neighbors had built for the average case and been caught when the average didn't apply. The storm finally broke on January 1st, 1883. Families emerged from Eric's cabin into a transformed landscape, a white world where familiar landmarks had vanished under drifts that reached second-story windows. The sun shone brilliantly on devastation that revealed itself as settlers made their way back to their claims. 11 roofs had failed completely. Their structures collapsed into the spaces below. 4 more had partially collapsed, losing loft areas or back rooms while main sections held. The weight of the snow had been too much for conventional framing, and the wind had finished what the weight had started. Entire seasons of work lay scattered under the white, and families who had survived the storm now faced the harder task of surviving the winter without shelter. Eric's cabin stood exactly as he'd built it. The roof showed no sag, no spread, no sign of strain. The shingles lay flat and tight against the sheathing. The ridgepole ran as straight as the day he'd raised it. The only evidence of the storm was the snow berms piled around the foundation where 9 days of sliding snow had accumulated, berms so high they nearly reached the eaves, testimony to how much snow the steep pitch had refused to carry. Margaret Tanner asked the question everyone was thinking. How did you know it needed to be so strong? Eric showed them the joinery, the timber grades, the iron straps that held everything together. In hard anger, he said, we lose villages to snow that piles too heavy. We learn to build roofs that snow cannot break. He gestured toward the steep pitch visible through the window. Snow that slides off cannot pile up, and timber this size carries any load that stays. His grandfather's voice echoed in the words, "A gentle roof invites the snow to stay. A steep roof tells it to go." The spring of 1883 brought rebuilding and reassessment to the valley. Families who had lost their roofs faced a choice: rebuild quickly with conventional framing and hope for milder winters, or invest the time and labor in something that could survive another Christmas siege. The decision was harder than it seemed. Heavy timber construction required trees that weren't easy to find, skills that weren't common, and time that farming families couldn't easily spare. But some made the choice anyway. George Tanner was the first to ask Eric for help. The man who had called the Norwegians' roof cathedral building overkill now wanted to understand every detail of its construction. He arrived at Eric's door in March with a notebook and measuring tape, asking questions about pitch angles and timber dimensions and where to bolt the iron. Eric taught him without any trace of vindication. He showed him how to select trees, looking for old-growth timber with tight grain and no rot, the kind that rang like a bell when you struck it with an axe head. He explained the pitch of it, steep enough that snow couldn't hold, but not so steep the wind could get under and tear it loose. And he demonstrated the joinery that distributed loads from rafter to ridgepole to wall without concentrating stress at any single point. The key, Eric explained, is building heavy enough that nothing surprises you. A light roof hopes for gentle winters. A heavy roof doesn't care what comes. By summer, folks were starting to copy that roof of his. 3 families ordered iron straps from the territorial capital, hardware that wouldn't arrive until fall, but would anchor their new roofs to walls that had proven too weak to hold conventional construction. 2 more families hired Eric to help them fell and square the massive timbers his design required, learning the broadaxe work that Norwegian builders had passed down for generations. The ring of axes on old-growth timber echoed through the valley all summer long. The pitch was harder to sell. A 60-degree roof looked strange on the frontier, more European than American, and it genuinely did consume more material than conventional construction. Some families compromised on 45 degrees, steep enough to shed most snow, shallow enough to feel familiar. Others went the full 60, trusting Eric's experience over their own instincts. The territorial newspaper sent a correspondent in August to report on what they called the Norwegian roof movement. The article described the Christmas siege and Eric's surviving cabin and the community's turn toward heavy timber construction. The correspondent reckoned that a properly built heavy roof cost 3 times the labor of conventional framing, but could survive loads that would flatten lighter structures. The arithmetic made sense when you looked at what failure cost. A collapsed roof meant lost possessions, lost shelter in the deadliest months, and risk of injury or death to families sleeping below. The families who had survived the Christmas siege by fleeing their homes, running into blizzard darkness in night clothes, sheltering in root cellars or neighbors' cabins, understood that a roof wasn't just carpentry. It was the difference between security and catastrophe. And a few extra tons of timber was a small price for sleeping through storms that kept lighter-roofed families awake in terror. The Tanner family moved into their new cabin in October 1883, 10 months after the storm had nearly killed them. The roof was pitched at 50 degrees, a compromise George had negotiated with his own pride. But the timber was as heavy as Eric had recommended, and the iron straps anchored everything to walls that had been rebuilt twice as thick as before. The ridgepole weighed 600 pounds. The rafters were 6 by 8 instead of 2 by 6, and the whole structure could have supported a herd of cattle on the roof without complaint. "It's the most roof I've ever put over a cabin," George admitted at the completion gathering, "and I'll sleep better for it." By the winter of 1884 to 85, 7 cabins in the valley had been rebuilt or newly constructed with the heavy timber roofing. Another storm that December, not as severe as the Christmas siege, but bad enough to collapse 3 of the remaining light frame structures, proved the point that Eric had made and nature had confirmed. The heavy roofs didn't notice the storm at all. Their owners slept through nights that sent other families scrambling for shovels and props. Word spread beyond the valley through letters and visitors. A mining camp in the high country sent representatives to learn Eric's methods after a bunkhouse collapse killed 2 men. A ranch in the foothills ordered copies of the drawings Margaret Tanner had made, detailed sketches of joinery and pitch angles and where to set the straps. The knowledge that had come from Hardanger spread through the mountain territories, adapted to American timber and American tools, but always carrying the same essential truth. A roof built heavy enough didn't care what the sky dropped on it. Eric lived in his cabin for another 37 years, watching his children grow and his grandchildren arrive, and the valley fill with structures that carried echoes of Norwegian building in their steep pitches and heavy frames. The roof he'd built in 1882 never required repair beyond occasional shingle replacement. The ridgepole didn't sag, the rafters didn't spread, the iron straps never showed any sign of strain. The cabin passed to his eldest son and then to his grandson, still standing solid in a valley where most of the original settlement had been rebuilt at least twice. The neighbors who had called his roof overkill eventually understood what Eric had known from the beginning, that the worst storm you've seen is never the worst storm that's coming, and that building for the average was just another way of gambling against the worst. American builders had trimmed their ways to fit the usual kind of winter, and the usual kind of winter had killed families when the unusual kind arrived. On the mountain frontier, where winter could bury the world and wind could tear apart anything that stood in its way, Eric had found a way to build something the weather couldn't touch. His neighbors had measured progress in days on the calendar and dollars on the ledger. Eric had measured it in generations, in a roof that would shelter his great-grandchildren and their children after them. The timbers kept holding, the pitch kept shedding, and families slept secure under roofs built by a man who understood that the old ways were sometimes old because they had survived everything the mountains could deliver. That overkill was just another word for margin. And margin was the only thing standing between a family and the storm that came once in a lifetime but came all the same.